Thank you for being here. This is the first lecture we have in our Interfaith Engagement series from the Center for Religion, Conflict, Transformation here at the School of Theology. I'm going to introduce Dr. Adam Seligman. Adam is a professor of religion at Boston University and research associate at the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. He has lived and taught at universities in this country, in Israel, and in Hungary, where he was a Fulbright Fellow. He lived close to 20 years in Israel, where he was a member of Kibbutz Kerem Shalom in the early 1970s. His many books include The Idea of Civil Society, Inner-Worldly Individualism, The Problem of Trust, Modernity's Wager, Authority, the Self, and Transcendence, and Community, Modest Claims, Dialogues and Essays in Tolerance and Tradition. And most recently with Weller, Rethinking Pluralism, Ritual, Experience, and Ambiguity. His work has been translated into over a dozen languages. He is director of the International Summer School on Religion and Public Life, now called CEDAR, I think, which leads seminars every year on contested aspects of religion and the public square in different parts of the world, and he lives in Newton. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. We always have busy semesters here, so I'm honored that you found some time to come and listen to what I have to say about something I've been doing for 12 years. I'll talk for a bit, and then I hope you have questions and we'll have a discussion. Let me say why I started the program, which is kind of funny coming from the bio, which is very heavily academic, right? All these books and this and the article and actually, I started the summer school because I felt I had problems with what we do in the university. I had problems with the way we approach knowledge, which is 90% cognitive, which is really, really important, but I think if we want to change people and change the world, we have to touch other parts of people, not just the head. That was one problem I had. I also felt very much about myself that all these books and all the articles and all this stuff doesn't really change anything. It's very satisfying, and it's great to be a professor. It's great to have books translated and written, but I don't actually think it changes anything. You know, when we're kids and we read a book, we get swept away by a book. We enter into the world of a book, especially fiction. Those of us in the university, we already know what we want when we read a book, and we take from it what we want to serve our purposes. It's very rare that we get, sometimes we do with great authors, and I'm not, you know, we get swept by the argument, but usually we use it for our own purposes. So we already know what we want when we enter a book. And I kind of came to the conclusion that if you want to change people, you have to model something. You have to address experience. You have to address more than the mind. You have to address other parts of how we access and live in the world. So I decided to do something else as well as my work in the university. And I have to say that for 12 years I was unwilling to write anything about the summer school. I always felt that there was something wrong, that we academics take from the world to have another line on our CV instead of taking from this incredibly privileged life that we live and bringing it back into the world. So I was very, very reticent and never wrote until recently anything about the summer school, and now after a dozen years with some others I've written a book, but that's only for PR reasons because we always need money. I'm hoping that a book will get the word out a little bit more. What we've been doing for 12 years now is bringing about 30 people or so from all over the world, from Zimbabwe and from Uganda and from Palestine and from Israel and from Russia and from Kabul and from Indonesia and from England and from the States and from Canada and from everywhere. People who are secular, sometimes for Brent secular, or people who are religious, of all religious, and I don't like the word, but of all different religious communities and more or less observant within their own tradition. And we bring people together for about 2 weeks. And over the years, and it really has been over the years, in the beginning we had no idea what we were doing, over the years we've really developed a certain pedagogy that combines academic, cognitive engagement. Every day there are 2 lectures, 1 or 2 lectures. An experiential component. Every day we go somewhere. We might go to a gay and lesbian church. We might go to a Palestinian refugee camp. We might go to a Roma encampment. So every day we go somewhere, and the program every year is in a different country. We've done it in Turkey, in Cyprus, in Israel, in Bulgaria, in England, in Indonesia, in Boston. Every year it's somewhere else. In fact, Seligman and I figured out we once met each other when we did it in Boston in the middle of the huge fight over the mosque. And at that point, the building of the mosque had been stopped, and it was an empty shell. And we brought the group into the empty shell, and I think met with Selma there and talked about it, what was going on. It was very interesting because at that time, the person who was working in the school was also an attorney who was defending the city against the lawsuit of the David Project, who sued the city for selling the land to the mosque. So that was interesting. So every day we go somewhere else, and we also go to services. And we don't go to services as a show and tell. We go to services, we go to mosque on Friday, to churches on Sunday, to synagogues if there are on Saturday or Friday night. And that's not for tourism, and in a minute I'll explain why. It's part of the whole group notion of what we're doing. So let me give you a type of something that happened in the school that's representative of many such stories. So we're in Indonesia, we're in Yogyakarta, and we go to a transgendered pesantren. Pesantren is a madrasa. So we go in Yogyakarta to a pesantren. There are maybe 15 to 20 men presenting as women who understand themselves as women trapped in men's bodies. Some of them, many of them are married to men. And they're deeply religious. And they're, as I said, they present as women. And it's a madrasa, it's a religious school. And they discuss with us what they're doing, and they recite from the Quran, and they do various recitals, and some of the fellows begin to fall apart. The Catholic priests from the Sudan, the Anglican priests from Zimbabwe, the woman from Kabul, they're having great difficulty dealing with the fact that somebody could be transgendered, a man can present as a woman, and be deeply religious. So much so, in Indonesia, wherever you go, people give you these little boxes with food, usually sweets. Somebody claimed that the average weight in Indonesia went up by 5 kilos when they started that about 10, 15 years ago. These people from the group couldn't eat the food that was given. Some people went back to the hotel. The first thing they did was they took a shower, and they said it. I began to understand impurity. In other words, when I saw this, I began to understand the concept of impurity in a real way. That's what these people felt. They felt that they had come in touch with something impure. So that's part one. Part two, of course, this is on an individual level. But people are embarrassed to express this in a plenum, to talk about it. Because this type of reaction goes against the assumed liberal, accepting, universal position that we all, whoever we are supposed to have. So you have to both deal with the reactions of these people, but you also have to make a space where it's legitimate for them to talk about their reactions, and they're caught between their reaction and feeling that there's something that will be, that will set the group off by enunciating and articulating what they felt. And this type of event, in essence, is very typical of what happens in the school, because the school is about encountering our boundaries. It's very nice to say we should all live with difference and be multicultural and embrace difference and so on, but how do you do it? The usual way we do it, psychosocial way we do it, is in some way assimilating the other into the self, saying we're the same. Of course, the problem is that when I say we're the same, I generally mean that you're like me, not like I'm like you. Right? That's one of the problems, right? It never enters my mind that I could be like you. instead you're like me. And really, so the real aim of the school is to encounter difference and to learn to accept difference, that difference is real, that it goes all the way down, as it were, that it goes all the way down, that what is different in us is what's constitutive of us. As I say to my students sometimes, my mother told me I'm special, I'm sure your mother told you you're special. What I want to be recognized in is in my specialness, not that we both have brown eyes. That's not what's interesting. That's not what I want recognition, right? Recognition is a big word now. Charles Taylor, no, recognition. But I want recognition of what's unique to me. What's unique to me is exactly where it's different from you. So very often, and we actually have an alumni of the school in the room here, who can talk as well about the experience from the other side, as it were. But I think what's very important is the willingness in a very careful and hopefully concerned environment to encounter discomfort. To encounter discomfort, to learn that you could live with what's uncomfortable. It's not the end of the world. Being uncomfortable is not the end of the world or your world. It's just being uncomfortable. And that actually discomfort can very often be a road to knowledge. So it's about meeting boundaries, meeting our own boundaries, and everybody's boundaries are different, and learning to negotiate these boundaries. My ultimate hope, and I think people have different, not agendas, but different aims, people involved in the school, is that in the period of 2 weeks, even if it's temporary, even if it's contingent, we manage to build trust across differences. In other words, that we accept differences. We don't privatize difference. And this is why going to a synagogue on Saturday or a church on Sunday or a mosque on Friday is important, because we're not going as tourists, because when we go, the group splits up. Some people attend services and some people don't. Some people stand in the back. In the church, I always stand in the back. Not only that, the guy who we were playing ball with and complaining about the director about, all of a sudden, he's the one who's giving out communion. You didn't know Max was a Catholic priest, did you? And so that also shatters lenses. And that's a lot what the school is about. It's about seeing how we are all in the world in very many different ways, and we can relate to one another in different ways. Some of them more comfortable, some less comfortable. That's an important lesson to learn. I remember one year in Bulgaria in 2011, it was very interesting. We had, because we want to go to a church on a Sunday, we were very upset that we missed services. People didn't get up on time. It's a long story. And we're trying to think what to do. And that Saturday night, I guess it was, there was a yearly ritual where they move an icon from one church to another. And very special, they sing, it's the only time in the year that a mass that's only sung in monasteries is sung outside of the monastery. So we do this. Okay, what's the problem? The problem is that the Metropolitan, Nikolai, is very, very conservative, very media conscious, and actually in a multi-generational fight with our local host and her father and grandfather. It's another story. Small town. And part of this service could easily be interpreted as only for Bulgarian Orthodox. And those who are not Bulgarian Orthodox couldn't be in the service. So we had this discussion. If we go in together, and some people are asked to leave, does everybody leave or not? Are we a group or are we individuals? It's a very, very important thing. Are we a group or from my perspective, if we're individuals, it's a waste of time. I wasted a year. Fundraising and program building and everything else, if all we are individuals. But if we're a group and we go together and you're asked to leave because your head is covered, it's quite clear you're not Bulgarian Orthodox. And the only people who were clear that they weren't Bulgarian were the 2 guys from Zimbabwe and the 3 women whose heads were covered. And it was a fascinating discussion that ended in tears. And there was an Anglican priest from Zimbabwe, it was fantastic, Paul Gawis. He said, look, you can tell me that I'm going to be asked to leave the church because I'm not Bulgarian Orthodox, but I'm going to feel that I'm asked to leave the church because I'm black. You can be sure of that. And so there was a crisis, and we talked about it for 3 days. I mean, not from morning till night, but 3 different meetings to work this out. At one point, I remember a Bulgarian who actually had once studied for the priesthood said, well, why can't you take your hijab off? She said, I can't take it off. Why can't you? You weren't born with it. At which point a secular Israeli woman started to applaud, which was a very hostile act. But he finished the sentence, he said, but if you're asked to leave, I'll leave with you. For me, that's like the height of what I want to reach in the school. I don't agree with you. I think you're wrong. But at least now we're a group, and if you're asked to leave, I'll leave with you. I'll tell you one more story before I start to try to give you some principles and some background, but because I think it's an interesting story. So one of the people involved in the school is Elizabeta Koneska, who's a visual anthropologist from Macedonia. She showed a fantastic movie called Shared Shrines, which is about a shrine in a little village in Macedonia that everybody uses. The Sunni, the Baktashi, the Orthodox, the evangelicals, everybody uses it. And everybody just takes the other guy's icons or pictures off the wall, puts it under the kiln and puts their pictures on. And then the other guys come and they take it. No problem. I mean, it's really short movie, 30-minute documentary. The reactions were fantastic. The secular people started, right, the end of religion, we're all one. If there only was no religion, this is the way to go. The Russian Orthodox went nuts. This isn't religion, this isn't orthodoxy. And the 2 Muslims from the Balkans, one from Kosovo and one from Bosnia, went ballistic and got very, very upset. So now what was fascinating, if you think about it, the mosque was a traditional society. The boundaries are fluid, they're fuzzy, you can negotiate them. We're not dealing in binary categories. The reactions, both of the Orthodox and of the Muslim, the Russian Orthodox, and of the Muslims, as well as the secular Israeli, were all pure modern reactions. We deal with binaries. It's this or it's that. It can't be both. It can't be mixed. It can't be shared. This isn't Islam. This isn't Orthodoxy. Luckily, we had among us both a professor of Islamic law from the University of Toronto and the expert on Orthodoxy in the Balkans, who gave sort of on-the-spot 20-minute impromptu lectures about exactly what Islam is in the Balkans and what Orthodoxy is. But that's the type of thing that happens, and that's how I think we learn in a way that can change us, in a way that I, anyway, cannot manage to do in my seminars in Boston University on this side of the river or the other side of the river. It doesn't matter. In other words, the connection with the place, we go, we have a lecture on the Roma, we go to the Roma ghetto of Stolopenovo, which is the largest Roma encampment in Europe. There are about 50,000, 45,000 people there. We have lectures about it there. We meet with the Roma, and then we talk about it. So I'm sorry, I forgot. So one aspect of the school is cognitive. We have lectures. Another aspect is going places. Every day we have a field trip. And another one is facilitation, which is every second day, the group is divided up into small groups of 5 or so. And at that morning's staff meeting, the staff comes up with a question connected to the theme of what we're doing that day, not the general theme. So it could be describe a situation where you felt in tension with your group of belonging, right? Or describe a situation where you felt you were judged for what you are instead of who you are. It could be this. And these little groups discuss it among themselves. There are certain rules of the road. You can't interrupt one person. There are different goals being worked at there. One is to get everybody to participate, because in plenums, you all know there's always the same person who raised, or the same 4 people who always raise their hands. So you want to get people for whom English is not their native language, talk more slowly to be able to participate. So that's kind of the structure. We started to add another component in Bulgaria 2 years ago, or less, was it? In 2013, which was a little minor field work. We went to a village, people lived with villagers, and did field work about a question and then reported. And that was a very interesting experiment that we're continuing to do, and actually in the school that we'll be doing in Uganda in December, we'll also be staying with refugees in southwestern Uganda. One of the, for me, extremely fulfilling things that has happened over the years is that people who've come to the school as fellows or as organizers or as lecturers have said, well, this is really important, we need this where we live. And so Maximiliano, who's both a priest and the head of the Good Government Department at Uganda Martyrs University, came to a program we did in Cyprus and Israel. We did a program, a week in Nicosia and a week in Tel Aviv-Yafo, on divided cities, right? One is the capital of one, Nicosia has an international border running right through it, and Tel Aviv-Yafo is, as it were, one city, but it's really a divided city. So Max finished that program, he said, I learned in 2 weeks what I couldn't learn in 5 years. We need this in East Africa, and he raised funds, and this December will be the second school that they're doing in Uganda, at Uganda Martyrs University. In Zimbabwe, we now already have a cohort of 8 or 9 people who have come to many different schools, all Anglican priests who want to put together a school in Zimbabwe. We're still desperately looking for money. The Bulgarians who hosted the school in 2011 were, for some reason, captivated by it. The first school we did in Bulgaria was called A Mosaic of Margins. We looked at marginal groups. Jews, Roma, Muslims, Pomaks. Pomaks are ethnic Bulgarians who converted to Islam during the Ottoman period. Gays and lesbians, a mosaic of margins. We looked at how margins are dealt with in Bulgarian society. And they also raised funds, and this summer will be the third school we do in Bulgaria. And there are also attempts to raise money now in Central Asia, as well as in Japan, to continue this. That we've done all this on a shoestring is unbelievable to me. I mean, it's unbelievable. I used to just run off money in my basement, but then the machine broke down, and I had to know how we could do it since then. But I guess, could I talk for 10, 15 more minutes?
Yeah,
10 minutes before?
Yeah.
Because I'd like to go into some of the principles of the school. So the practice came first and the principles came later. Figured out the principles after we've been doing this for a few years. Didn't start with this theory. So one of the things that I should have known, because my original sort of profession as a sociologist, is the importance of the old Durkheimian notion that knowledge is collective. We don't know things individually, we know them as part of a collective, especially our moral knowledge, right? We know them as part of a group. Our categories, our ways of understanding, the basic frame of meaning, as well as our fears, our desires, our hopes, most of them are collective. Most of them we share with a particular group of belonging. They're social. They're in a very strong sense social. So, if this is true, and I think it's true, then if you think the next step, what we know is to a great extent bound up with who we trust. That being our group, right? That being our group. So there's a connection that maybe it's not a healthy connection, but that there's a connection between what we know and who we trust. And this is important because in what goes for knowledge also involves granting moral credit, which is a very important word for us, moral credit, to a certain individual or groups of individuals. Now, what do I mean? I mean, most of us would not dispute certain facts. The knifing of a marcher at the Gay Pride Parade in Jerusalem. The building of a mosque in Lower Manhattan, near the site of the World Trade Center. The positioning of both hidden as well as non-hidden cameras around the Muslim neighborhood in Birmingham, England. These are, let's say, facts. But what do we mean? What do they mean? How do we interpret them? That's already an almost endless, infinite sets of knowledge and information and bits of information are necessary to know how to interpret these different facts. So when I want to understand, let's say, the positioning of the cameras in the Muslim neighborhood in Birmingham, do I trust the analysis of the Metropolitan Police, or do I trust the analysis of my Muslim neighbor? What gatekeeper of the necessary ancillary information do I trust? It's not clear. That's an example of what I mean, that knowledge is connected to trust. The bit of information isn't, but we don't build our worldview on bits of information, but on the interpretation of the bits of information. And for that, we already have to engage other people, and then the question is, which other people, right? How do we frame the act? Who do we believe in our framing of the act? How do we understand the knifing of the gay marcher in the parade in Jerusalem? What set of information is relevant? The civic code or the religious code? And so on and so on. I'm not privileging one or the other. I'm just giving examples of what I mean, that knowledge and understanding is connected also to trust. So these communities, within which moral credit is granted, are to a great extent communities of belonging. They're where we feel at home. They can be secular, they can be religious. Each has their own code, set of beliefs, myths. And of course, communities of belonging are not universal. They're bounded. Every community is bounded, or it's not a community. There's no such thing as a universal open community. Communities are bounded just as families are bounded. They have their own histories, their own trajectories, their own languages, their own jokes, their own obligations, their own taken for granted, their own flavors, their own smells, their own understandings of home. Just think of your family. It's not my family. It's not the other guy's family. This is true of communities. These communities may be more or less open, more or less ascribed. Their boundaries may be more or less permeable, but they do have boundaries. And they always define some us against some other them. And that's one important place where our program is different from just about every other program that I know. We don't focus on what we have in common. We focus on first admitting our differences. Because I really think that what we have in common, we share 98% of our DNA with baboons. That doesn't help us a lot. That doesn't help us a lot. It doesn't give us information that's necessary for building a civic society. It gives us biological information. You know, the great anthropologist Gregory Bateson said, difference is information. Think about it. Difference is information. And if you don't have difference, you don't have, if the map was just, you know, all white, you wouldn't have any information. The map marks the differences. The differences gives us information. So you can't do that. You can't, the attempt to erase differences, to make a claim for this overall oneness is in the transcendent realm, not in this realm. So the first premise is that knowledge is collective. The second premise is that these communities are real, live, active entities within which human actors are born, thrive, live, die, and make sense of their world and the worlds of others. We cannot live without these communities, despite all the dangers, and we certainly recognize the dangers of community. Nobody, you know, is trying to paper over those differences. But we just don't believe that humans can exist outside of these communities. And then, this then brings us to the challenge of the school that I mentioned earlier. Can we build trust across communities? Can we maintain the differences, maintain our commitment to these differences? And that's one of the very important principles in the program, is that your collective, or it's often religious obligations, become the programs. So if you have to go to synagogue, if you have to observe halal or kashrut, if you go to mosque on Friday or synagogue on Saturday, the program has kashrut, dietary restrictions of Muslims and Jews. This is the program's problem. We have to provide for that. It's not like when I go to Europe and, okay, what are you going to eat, Adam? That's your problem. You know, it's not a private problem. It's not a private problem. And we do everything that's necessary to make sure that everybody can eat what they have to eat. And so far we've managed. But that's an important principle here. That because we reject the kind of liberal default of privatizing difference. No, the differences are public. They have a place in the public realm because they make us who we are. We're here with all that heavy, smelly baggage. So it's the program's responsibility to take care of it. And we do. I've got a restaurant in more than one restaurant in Plovdiv that bought totally new pots and pans and stove, you know, coal stove. So that's very, very important. That's very important. Can we, as individual members of different communities, construct a minimum framework of trust in just some small area of knowledge that will allow us then to construct a shared world of reference? To what extent then, putting the same problem slightly differently, to what extent then can we grant moral credit to another who is not a member of our group? To what extent are we willing to step out of our group of belonging, not in a matter of scientific knowledge that Leslie can give, but in the matter of a moral claim, are we willing to step out of our community and grant moral credit to another? So that's why it's very important. And sometimes it's really a problem to get people to mosque or to synagogue or to church, and you can't get to all the churches, right? I mean, that's a problem because you've got Catholics and Methodists and Episcopalians and Anglicans, and there are only 2 Sundays in the program, right? But you do your best. And what's very important, and I think maybe I've managed to give some sense of it, what's very important for us is this notion of shared experience. And for me, theoretically, which is, I guess, a dirty word for me, but it's central. In other words, can we share experience without sharing meaning? I'll give you a little example, a little type of example. When we did the program in Bursa, which was the first capital of the Ottoman Empire, so Bursa is an interesting place because it's one of the places that Jews came when they left Spain, and there's still a synagogue there built in the shape of the boat in the 16th century. And anyway, so it was Friday night, and I was there with my daughter. So we had a bigger room. So we said, look, we're going to light candles at, let's say, whatever it was, 7 o'clock, and everybody's invited, but it's going to be boring because then we're going to pray. So if you want to come at 8, we'll say the blessing over the wine and break bread, whatever you want. 14 people show up at 7 o'clock. 10 Jews, 3 Muslims, and a Christian. And the 10 Jews include men and women, and Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. That is, people for whom women count as a quorum, and people for whom women do not count as a quorum. But you only had 10. So the people for whom women count needed the guys for whom women don't count. So Jews start fighting, right? The Jews start fighting. And like the other guys are sitting on the bed, like, absolutely fascinating. And the Jews find a solution. The Jews, we found a solution, which is a totally legal solution, which was basically the men for whom women don't count said, you do what you want. I said, great, but you guys are staying. Yep, okay. I led prayers. I led prayers that we had a quorum. Whether they answered amen, I don't know, that's their business. They didn't leave the room. They didn't leave the room. They stayed, they prayed. Whether they participated by answering amen at those places for which, I don't know. We found a way to share an experience within certain boundaries, to share an experience with very different meanings, which was fascinating in many ways because the next day one of the Turkish women came to me and said, wow, I didn't know Jews fought. I know where she was living, but she also said, I couldn't believe that women would argue with men about religion. So, I mean, this was very instructive for a lot of people in different ways, as so many things in the summer school are. So that's why the shared experience, the embodied knowledge, what we learn through doing, is just like a kid who learns to tie their shoes through doing, not from the book, right? You learn to walk downstairs by doing, not by sort of sitting and having your mother tell you how to go downstairs. No, you learn by doing. And this is all about learning by doing. And I guess we came, and with this I'll end, we came to a very, very important understanding that the type of knowledge that we're trying to develop in the school and trying to share and trying to encourage other people to develop is a knowledge for, not a knowledge of. We focus on knowledge for. Knowledge of, it's his business. We can't actually know of. We could know for. What do I need to know? of you or your community in order to do X with you, right? If I want to work with, I don't know, the Muslims in my neighborhood to get the city to put more lights on in the park and get the drug dealers out, what do I have to know? Do I have to know the meaning of jihad? Do I have to know I have to know not to serve pork sandwiches and not to do it during Jummah, to call our meeting during Jummah. That's what I have to know. I don't need more. I don't need you to sign off on a number of principles about place of women and religion and terrorism and Palestine and Jerusalem. I don't need that. That's the way to start to make sure you'll never do anything together. So you start with what you need to do X. My guess is, if you manage to do X, well, maybe we can do Y. X plus. Again, so maybe I don't need to know a little bit more now to do more with you. Maybe we want to run somebody to city council. By the way, what was generative in this was the only bi-communal project in Cyprus that ever worked between the north and the south. It was in Nicosia, which was to build a shared sewer system. Nobody wanted this city to smell of sewage. It's the only program that ever worked, and that became the basis of the Annan Plan. No principles, no ideology, just like the city shouldn't smell of garbage. So my claim is that if we manage to walk together a little by doing this, without knowing a lot, and then manage to get this done, and then manage to get this done, and we've walked and we've walked, and we could turn around and say, wow, we've come all this way together. We have a shared past. I don't know how this happened, but we have a shared past. And a shared past is a pretty important thing for the building of solidarity. So that's my short 45-minute spiel. And I'd love to talk more and answer questions, because I know I left out all kinds of important stuff. So please feel free to ask any type of question anybody wants. Yes?
Thank you. That was just amazing. I really appreciate your incredible insights. I just wanted to ask a little bit about your whole theory about boundaries and about the whole out-group contact and trying not to minimize boundaries, but to maintain them, right? But at the same time, the kind of trust that you're building seems to be deconstructing the othering. You know, it seems like when you work with somebody on a joint project, really what you're doing is figuring out ways that you are the same, ways that, you know, you both are people who want to live in a city that doesn't smell. You know, that's a way that you're alike. Mm-hmm. And so then you build this trust over time, and even though you're still in your own communities, it's almost like you have another boundary now that you've built around drawn a circle that's bigger, right? Because you've de-emphasized even though you have that, maintaining that salience of your in-group.
So that's what's important. To maintain the salience of the in-group, not to deny it, not to privatize it, not to minimize it, because if you do, and just base it on our joint engineering project, the next time the bomb goes off in the subway, everything is going to metaphorically blow up. So I think you're right, and that's clear, and that's an important thing. I don't know if we're alike, but we have a shared interest and a shared project. I think, to me though, I wouldn't put the emphasis on interest, but more on the shared doing. I mean, maybe because I was a farmer for many years before I became an academic, I think doing is really important. We do things together, we engage the world, we've changed the world a little bit, and we've done it together. I think that's a very important thing. So, in principle, yes, but I think what often happens in practice is the two moves. One is we tend to negate, minimize, privatize those differences. And second is we frame our togetherness in terms of interests rather than in terms of shared doing.
So then would you say that you prioritize maintaining the boundaries of identity that have to do with things like beliefs and culture, and try to deconstruct or minimize the identity markers that have to do with interests that are just sort of human and that are, you know, more kind of experiential?
Well, we want people, you know, it takes a week to get people to admit the differences, to admit that they're real, that they're important. It takes a week. That's why the program is 2 weeks, because the first week is just getting to a place where people are comfortable enough to say they could be uncomfortable. I remember in one program, it was the one in Bulgaria, It was a great week. People had a great time. And I said, I'm not going to let them get away with this. I didn't waste my whole year just for everybody to have. This isn't the summer camp, right? This isn't the summer camp. What did I do? This is a huge amount of work that I do outside of my job. And so I said, okay, I got to break this. And they had a great party, a drunk, and played. It was great. So the next day I said, okay, this was a Monday. I said, okay, who here has been made uncomfortable by going to other people's houses of worship? 9 hands went up, and then we were off. And that allowed a space for people to talk.
Not to just paper it over.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. And I should say one aspect of the pedagogy, I talked about those 3 important principles which are indeed important. But another one is every morning we have a kind of little half-hour session where we just go over what happened the day before and point out something that maybe struck one as important. We went to, I remember this was terribly important, we went to the cathedral in Coventry, and we did it in Brum. And the new cathedral was built adjacent to the bombed out one. And they have a chapel of unity. They have a chapel of unity. And it's fascinating because it's a globe. It's a globe. There's a mosaic on the floor of a globe with a dove in the middle. And it's slightly on an incline. And there was a German guy that was working there. And so he gave everybody a golf ball and said, drop the golf ball. So because it was a little bit on an incline, they all went down. One didn't, he sort of kicked the golf ball. Now, a dove in a church isn't just the dove of peace. It's also the Holy Spirit. So there was something going, now there were Muslims there were Jews there were people who wouldn't feel very comfortable about participating in this oneness of Christian unity on the Holy Spirit. So that needed talking out the next day. So every day we have a little session in the morning where such things are, and that could then lead to interesting discussions. So that's part of it, not to hide, not to paper over, to come with who we are, and not to just turn into a credit card in our PhD or whatever these universal markers of being have become.
Thank you.
Was that?
That was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So.
I'm curious, in the example that you gave of the transgender madrasa in Indonesia, how did you how did the issues come up after the fact? Because it sounds like people participated and then went off and did their thing afterwards. How did you bring that out? So
it came to us in different forms personally, and I decided I had to it was wrong not to give people space. No, it was wrong. I had a pedagogic obligation to make the space to allow people to talk about it. One part of the program, and the program is, for the fellows, it starts at 7:30 in the morning, it ends at 10:30 at night. For the organizers, it starts at 6 in the morning and ends like 11:30 at night. Because we have staff meetings every day where we talk about what's going on. And one component of the program that's terribly important is we have an evaluator who's not external but internal. It might be an external evaluation, but that's something else. And that person's job is like a resident anthropologist. And it's always been a she, shouldn't be. And she does participant observation. She interviews people. She, in the end, the very last day, she does this whole morning just with the fellows and not with any of the staff. And her job is to know what the hell is going on. Because when you're making decisions for 40 people from all over the world, and so the sort of the administrative component that makes the decision doesn't have the time to reflect on it, doesn't. But somebody does, and then can bring that to the group, to the staff meeting. And that's a way, and this is up front. I mean, people, for instance, it's important to know, so that story that I told you about Paul, the African from Zimbabwe, and you're not going to let me into the church because I'm black, and the women with the hijab and all that. So that was very interesting what happened. So you had a number of very tense days. So in the days before that, so people had no problem sitting, which we always encourage, sit for meals, not with people from your own country, your own language, but mix it up. So in the period of tension, people started to again sit with their own countrymen. That's very interesting. That's something that the evaluator noticed. We were too busy doing payments, doing this, doing zillions of other things during meals and didn't have the time to look. But that's an important thing. Because you get a sense of what's happening. So people are feeling threatened. So they go and they sit with their group of belonging, right? Because, yeah.
What you're describing is basically a voluntary community of sorts.
Correct.
I wondered if you had thought about it, maybe have done an experiment in a classroom situation where if you had a topic that would work, having the students in a similar way try to recognize differences in areas that you might think they would have obvious disagreements, and then get them to, in a similar way, respect the differences and work together on whatever project.
So we had an idea. One year I wanted my students to be uncomfortable. I wanted to see what we could learn from discomfort. And we worked together to try to think of, it was a small seminar, what situation could we go to that would cause discomfort? And somebody said, and it was a mixed group, mixed of undergraduates and graduates, and then the woman said, why don't we go to a strip club? And I actually thought that was a great idea, because I know I would be uncomfortable. Deanna just walked out, but I went to Deanna, who was the chair, that she said, you're crazy. All you need is somebody to take a photo on a phone of Professor Seligman in a strip club. And, you know, she was right, of course. So that's as far as we got with that. I'm very hesitant within the framework of what I see as my mandate in the university to deal with the type of things I deal with in the summer school. Do you want to say anything more about this? Since Laura was both a student in a couple of my classes and also in the school.
I think the BU population, despite its relative diversity, especially in our religion classes, for instance, it tends to be fairly homogenous. And there's a fairly, not universal, but it's pretty expected that there's a fairly liberal point of view regarding religion. I've never had an extremely conservative classmate in any of my classes here. I've had extremely conservative students, which presents its own challenges. But for me in the summer school, it was confronting really radically different identities and people and commitments that made it challenging for me and really made a difference for me. And I feel like that's really hard to replicate in this particular context.
Remember too that people are from their 20s.
Yeah, I was about to add about age. Like that was also. I mean, I was the babies by many years, so but it was a much wider age range too.
And you're doing everything together except sleeping. You're together all the time. All the meals, all the entertainment, which is not everything, which is one of the reasons why we always insisted people have their own hotel rooms and their own bathrooms. So at the end of the day, you can close the door, and I don't want to see nobody. Right? But because you are constantly with people, you cannot retreat. And so the internet causes a problem. And for us, it's much worse than in a classroom, that people can go online in this. So often, without telling them, we just cut the internet off in the building.
That's why it was so bad.
Correct. Yeah.
What's your hope for this sort of movement that you're starting? What would be an analogous equivalent global program that you're advocating? Because ever since I've taken your class, I've thought a lot about the idea of human rights and humanness. And you said earlier in your lecture that we don't have a community that's global, but isn't there one, or else what is this shared experience? What allows us to share the experiences if we don't have something in common already?
So those are two different questions. So one is a practical question, one is a theoretical question. So the practical question is, all I want, I'm not getting younger, all I want is for the school to replicate itself. That the people in Uganda and Bulgaria managed to continue to raise funds, that the people in Zimbabwe managed to raise funds, that the people in Kyrgyzstan raise funds, and my view is if you could have a network of half a dozen, but there's no limit to it, of these schools, and my dream is to move people between them. So an evaluator from Bulgaria teaches people in Zimbabwe, the organizer of this in Zimbabwe goes to Kazakhstan, and you move people, and then you've really built a very, very important international network of people with different substantive visions, but a shared method. And that's my point here, right? A shared method different values, different religion, different gods, right? I think, they think I'll go to hell. I think they believe in nonsense. It doesn't matter. But a shared vision of how we can live together. That's all I want. That's all I want. That and not having to beg every day for another $2,000 or $50, something like that. Your second question sort of involves, for me anyway, to answer it the way, a whole lecture in sociology. But I mean, what we share as humans is a lacuna, right? What we share in humans is the fact that our genetic program is open and that we consciously have to construct the world of our division of labor. That's what we share. Not something that is, but something that isn't, right? I mean, Marx said this, right? What's the difference between the worst of architects and the best of bees, right? That even that the worst of architects has to draw up the plan ahead of time, right? We have to consciously make our world. We have to consciously build our division of labor, which means we have to consciously come up with the rules of this division of labor. And then the question is how we do this, and what are the tools that we use to do this? And we're trying to contribute just about that much to that. So a longer answer is a longer answer.
I'd like to go back to the knowledge for and the
Yep.
knowledge on. I connected actually with this dialogue you just had.
Yep.
So this is your vision of what you hope.
Yep.
Could you take an example of a situation of conflict and play it out in relationship to knowledge for and knowledge to? Whether you can choose Gaza, you can choose whether or not there's a local town is going to allow the building of a mosque. You can choose any one you want, but if you could just play it out for us, it would be helpful. A conflict that seems to be intractable.
So let's put aside the intractable, but I think so let's look at the attempt to stop the building of the West Roxbury Mosque by the David Project, right? Who had a lot of money, right? And they sued the city, and they sued the mosque, and they sued people right, left, and center, and they kept it up, and they kept it up. They had very fair. What was behind it for them? What was behind it? Was it something about the mosque, or it was some ideological vision of Islam and Muslims, which is what I think it was. And I think actually what you'd want to do is you'd want to engage them on a pragmatic level, insofar as that would be possible, and maybe it wasn't. To find something like the sewage problem in Nicosia that would allow that type of engagement. I don't know. So this isn't, I'm thinking of an answer. One of the projects that I started in Bosnia, sort of at an early stage in the summer school, was getting people, so this was for young people, to rebuild some of the mosques and churches that were destroyed in the war in the village of Stolac. And the idea here was, if you're working together in the hot sun in August, 8 hours a day, moving, concrete from place to place, getting water from one person to another, you'll have your fights, your ideological fights in the evening, but they will take on a different tenor because you work together during the day. It'll just be different. You're not all of a sudden going to be converted to the other person's, but having worked together and solved practical problems like getting this 2x4 to move that boulder, whatever you want, that's going to inflect the tone, if nothing else, of your debates. And that opens a possibility that wasn't there before. And the point of the school is to open possibilities, is to provide a space where there wasn't one before. That's all. Knowledge for, I think, so Birmingham, England, is the second largest city. I think by now it's a city of a majority of ethnic minorities. That is, the majority of the population are not white, Anglican, Caucasians, but Sikhs and different Muslims and Hindus, West African Christians, people from all over. And there are a lot of problems in Birmingham. There's poverty, there's drug dealing, there's problems of garbage collection. And all these lessons I really learned in Birmingham because they're really about that. Birmingham is really, there's an interesting group called Citizens something, I forgot. They're big in London. They're sort of inspired by Alinsky, right, by the industrial areas, work of Saul Alinsky. And in Birmingham, they're led by different religious, in other words, a Muslim religious woman, a very observant woman, with some other West African Christians. In other words, people with deeply divergent religious visions and contradictory religious visions. And I know that some Christian people felt that they were, I wouldn't say, that their colleagues were trying to talk them into conversion to Islam. So it's not like there were intentions. But they focused on getting the drug dealers out of the park. What do I need to know of sajda? What do I need to know of, I can't remember her name, a woman from West Africa, in order to run a meeting together? What kind of sandwiches should we bring? Now this isn't a joke. If you've been following the news, one of the first things that Le Pen's city governments have put in place is doing away with the vegetarian options in schools and forcing pork lunches in the schools. So, this is small issue. It's not small at all. So just that, so you can feel welcome. So you have something to eat. So focus on how do we get the city council to take out garbage in the poor neighborhood once a week instead of once every 2 weeks. What do I need to know of you for us to work together to do that? Let's leave aside terror, ISIS, let's leave that aside. Your position on Palestine, let's leave that aside. What do we have to focus on that? So, and I think that, I don't think there's an abstract, I think in the nature of the question there's no general answer, because it depends on the case. So when I was a member of a kibbutz, which was a long time ago, on the border of Gaza, that by principle would not cross the border, in other words, would not go beyond the green line. There were all kinds of issues that came up with, and they were treated at that level, without the ideology. I mean, it's really straight Dewey pragmatism, in a sense. A lot of what I said comes straight out of John Dewey. Yeah. Straight out of John Dewey. Which, there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think. There's anything wrong with that. Yes, sir.
So, thank you for your talk, and the school sounds incredible. And I was just recognizing that in myself, and I think this is a fairly common human trend, if I have an experience, a single point experience, that would lead me to a very divergent conclusion from the baseline of my natural thought, it's much easier for me to just return to that baseline and think of that experience as atypical than it is to integrate. And your point about opening a door that wasn't open before, I was wondering if you work with that at all in the context of the school to prevent that door from just closing again back into the old patterns of thinking when people return to their...
People go home. So we don't have the capacity to do it. That's a very important question. We don't have the capacity to do it. It's very important that some people have taken up projects. So whether we had a teacher in the school in Bulgaria who went back to Rome and developed a project to totally reconstruct multicultural education in high schools in Rome out of what she learned. We had a director of citizenship education for the whole state of Israel. He came back to Israel. He brought together all his 620 or whatever as teachers, and started to work with them on how to structure citizenship education in Israel on the basis of what he learned in the school. And the next year he sent his deputy, who was actually a Palestinian woman from Yafo, who was in charge of citizenship and sociology in high schools in the Arab sector. So this is, so clearly, if 30 people did this, this would be fantastic. But if 3 people a year do this, that's 10%. That's also not bad. But I don't have a better answer than that. I wish we had the capability to do something like that. I was talking a long time today to colleagues in Bulgaria about an EU grant that they're trying to get that, if we got it, would actually encourage such a thing, meaning develop programs between schools. That would allow that. But I think that the point that you raised is something that I went over in passing, but it's actually very important. And that's, we focus on particularities. And that's critical to the school, and it's critical to the dynamic you're talking about, right? Because when you have this particular act that's atypical, you say it's an outlier, it's not. But if you can bring together enough particular events, meetings, in the period of 2 weeks, it starts breaking the frame that you have. And then you can't really put it together in exactly the same way, even when you go home. And so what's important is getting people to question the stories of their grandfathers, as it were. You see what I mean? Or the stories that we learned in schools about Turks or Jews or Scots or Blacks or Roma or whoever it happens to be. And it can only, to me, it can't be by countering theory 1 with theory 2, which is logically more coherent. It doesn't work. But experience of particulars and getting down to the level of particular, and not one, but multiple experiences. Which is, again, why the halal and the kashrut and all this becomes public, because so you begin to see, it's important. You go into your church and you feel at home, and everybody else feels kind of not at home, right? Because they're not, right? But you just had a great time with them, generally, as I say, playing ball or cursing the director or, you know, whatever it happens to be. I return to that again because that's part of an answer to you. One thing that builds solidarity in the beginning is being angry at me, and that's actually an important group building thing. But that's not on purpose; that just happens. but then you go to the synagogue and you feel totally, you don't know what the hell to do, and 3 other people are totally comfortable. And in fact, the guy you were playing ball with yesterday, he's leading the services, or the Catholic Church, and that begins to shift the way you understand yourself and place. Or you go to the mosque, and yeah, 3 Muslims go out and pray, but you know, Ahmed is outside smoking a cigarette. Hey, it's not 1.4 billion people, they're all the same, right? and it's not that you know it, it's that you experienced it. You knew it before. You knew it before. But now you lived it, and it's totally different. It's totally different. Just think about what you know through what you experienced. Think of climbing a mountain or reading a book about climbing a mountain. They're 2 totally different things. Totally different things. So it's the same with this. It's the same with this. It's totally different. The experience of the particular, rather than knowing that not all Muslims are religious or all Jews or whatever.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm interested in some of the nuts and bolts and some of the details about the program. So I have 2 questions. One, and this is related, I think, to the last question. I'm curious why 2 weeks? You've described that 1 week clearly isn't long enough, but why not 3 or 4 or 5? Is it strictly practical reasons, or is there a pedagogical?
We did it for 3 weeks once, and everybody's sort of.
Okay, it's exhausting.
It's utterly exhausting.
Okay.
Like, he's not getting 7:30 in the morning till 10:30 at night, and he doesn't believe in breaks.
Gotcha. Okay, great. And then my second question is, can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the norms that develop? And the reason why I ask is I think, you know, it's one thing to get a group of people who are different together, even even to experience something together, but that doesn't inherently lead to civil types of interactions and things like that. So are there any sort of like skills or norms or things about the program that you either try to teach the folks who are in the program or try to encourage throughout the program?
I'm not sure I understand.
Let me see if I can say it a little differently.
We take care of everybody.
Yeah.
We really, really, really take care of everybody. We would agree, Ron. In other words, we try to build a group. And actually, when I spoke, I was at a planning meeting with the guys from Bulgaria last summer. Now, it's interesting. Bulgaria is an outlier. Zimbabwe, Uganda, other people, they're all religious. And I don't think it's coincidental. They're all deeply committed religious people who've established programs. Muslims, Anglicans, Catholics, whatever. And I think it's important that they're religious people. Academics don't work too well. Academics are too statistical, sorry. In Bulgaria, they're academics, they're not religious. But what was important for them was the collective nature of this. So they're all socialists. In other words, no, but the collective, that this wasn't the program everybody does, everybody does their own thing. There's the building of a collective here. There's the building of a collective. It starts with that the administration really takes care of everything. It takes a year to build a program. It takes a year to build a schedule. And when we build a schedule, somebody goes and decides how, walks it through, how long it takes to go from where we're having lunch to where the next activity is. So things work on time. So everything is thought out in great detail, There's a bad side to that in that it disempowers people. The price of that is that it disempowers people to a certain extent. And got to find the balance of that. But so the idea is getting people to feel, one of the nuts and bolts is to feel we're a collective. To feel for these 2 weeks, temporary, we're a collective. And we're responsible for one another, hence the issue of do we leave the church or do we not leave the church? Are we there as individuals? And if you have to leave, that's your problem. I'll meet you at the bar, 3 hours from now. Or are we there as a group and it's a group activity? You have to go to all group activities. It's not a conference. It's not a conference. Oh, I want to hear Wes, I don't want to hear Adam. It's not a conference. You can't. You have to come to. There are 2 rules in the school. Maybe this is a critical thing that I did. 2 rules in the school. Only 2. First one is you have to come to everything. Because the idea is to meet the other. If the other isn't there, what's going on? And the second rule is, say everybody comes with their baggage. Everybody here thinks that their group has the monopoly on human suffering. The Jews think this, the Africans think this, the gays think this, the Palestinians think this, the Muslims think this, the women think this. Everybody thinks their particular group has the kushan, has the monopoly on suffering. Well, if you think that, then the other also isn't there. Because the other is just there as the function of your moral claims to him or to her. So we don't expect you to get rid of this feeling. We don't expect anybody to get rid of any feelings. I've been doing this 12 years, I haven't gotten rid of my feeling. But in our interaction with one another, we have to act as if we don't feel that we have the monopoly on human suffering. I'm a great believer in the subjunctive. I'm a great believer in the as if. Skeptical of claims to any authenticity. But if we can act as if we weren't making those claims, then you're there. Then I'm interacting with you as I'm at least open. Maybe I'm not, but I'm at least open to you, not as you owe me. Because of the Holocaust, or because of slavery, or because of Palestine, because of and so on, so patriarchy, there's no end to that. But then you're only there as a function of my demand to you, and then you're not you, I'm not looking at you, I'm not seeing you. Those are the only 2 rules. Somebody once said, if you could do that, then what do you need the school for? Yeah.
I just want to follow Adam's question.
Yeah.
So it's a technical question about how the school selects people. So because you said that you wanted difference, the difference is about information. So how would you balance differences when you decide among a big pool who will be the actual participants in the program?
So usually we have about 120 to 130 or 140 applicants for 30 slots. And this is ideally. Recently it's been difficult. The first 10 years, somehow money was not a problem. We paid for everything, and that was a very important principle, because if you don't pay for everything, then you get people with access to funds, and that's a particular type of person. And in a lot of the world, that's somebody connected to oligarchies, to corruption, to all kinds of things like that. So for 10 years, we really managed to pay. You know, if you want to bring a Catholic priest from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Indonesia, you've got to pay for his visa. You've got to pay for his airmail to get his visa. You know, because so you have all these applicants, and I guess the first thing is the school is. So we have an interest. We have an interest in that the fellows be what sociologists would call secondary elites. That is, people who have an impact on their community. So I'd be much more interested in a leader of an NGO, or a member of an NGO, or a priest with a parish of 700 people in Harare than I am in a graduate student, sorry. Right? We always have graduate students, but you have to maintain some level of academic respectability. Right? The graduate students provide that, hopefully. But so I have a great interest in people who can take something back to their communities and do something with it. And sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. But that's one criteria that we use. Also, we will, sometimes if we don't have applicants from the communities that we want, we'll go look for them. Like we're doing a school in Uganda in December, and or start differently. In 2012, we did a school in Uganda and Rwanda, and there were no Muslims in the school. 17% of the population of Uganda is Muslim. The Muslims in Rwanda saved people during the genocide. Little known fact. Little known fact. The only community that actively went out and saved people was the Muslim community. Whether this has to do with Islam, whether this has to do with they were a minority, I don't know. That's already a different discussion. But so you have, you want people from those communities who are members of the school. So it was a huge fashla, it was a huge failure that we didn't have. Or what was the name of the program that we did in Bulgaria when we were there? What was it called?
So I can't remember the
I can't remember
It
either.
was the syncretism.
Yeah, it was on religious syncretism. It was on religious syncretism, which was very big in the Balkans. We didn't have any Jews. I thought that was a huge failure. Huge, huge failure. There were such fascinating things going on in the Jewish community. For instance, up until now, there was never a problem of burying non-Jewish spouses in Jewish graveyards, which is amazing because it's totally not allowed by law. But in Bulgaria, it was totally accepted for 100 years. Now, rabbis from Israel are coming and saying you can't do it. The whole issue of syncretism is very interesting, and since Jews get really uptight about issues about boundaries, it would really be interesting to have Jews from Bulgaria in such a school. The fact that we didn't was a failure. So in that case, we went out and we looked for people, yeah, and we actually didn't find. We wanted more Bulgarian Muslim participants, but we couldn't find appropriate people. So I don't know, a combination of people write a short essay, write a 5-6 page essay, as well as fill out a questionnaire. So a combination of, if they took the essay seriously, and we asked them to discuss difference and the importance of difference in their community. Something like that. I can't remember the exact question. So it has to do with how they answer the essay. It has to do with their age. I'm kind of reticent to take somebody my age because it's a pretty difficult, physically it's a difficult program. Not people too young, not people too old, people who can make a difference, something like that.
The school sounds very powerful, so thank you for telling us about it. You touched on this before, but I just wondered if you had any examples of bringing Israelis and Palestinians together?
Yeah.
Do you have a story to share about that?
No, it wasn't a problem. We had a number of schools. Look, the interesting schools were not when we brought actually Israelis and Palestinians in England or somewhere else, but when we did it in Israel. We did a school in Israel 205. And then we did that school half in Nicosia and half in Tel Aviv Yafo. And both of them we had Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Israelis. We didn't have anybody from the territories in that program. We couldn't, although we did have, though we had my friend Mustafa from East Jerusalem who spoke from Malkutz University. But we actually did, with the help of the US Embassy, get people from Gaza to England. That was really cool. That was really cool. People. So there was some, I'll tell you an interesting story. Okay, I'll tell you a story, So that was, that 205 was really interesting. So we did, the day we discussed Palestinian refugees, we met in Lifta, which is an abandoned village at the entrance to Jerusalem. And it was abandoned in 48. And we sat in the houses, and that's when we started the discussion about the Palestinian refugee issue. So there's an American Jewish guy who said, you know, Adam, I've been to Israel 30 times. I've never been in an abandoned house. I said, well, it's about time. But that's not so I wanted to tell. We went to a refugee camp. I went to a refugee camp outside of Jerusalem and Mata, and we were supposed to meet with the Palestinian head of security. It's about 6 months with the PA head of security. We spent 6 months setting this meeting up, okay? That morning, he was lynched by Hamas. That morning, he was pulled out of his car. We didn't know that. So we didn't know that. So we arrived to the refugee camp where he was going to meet in his mother's house, and there's nobody there. He's not there. His mother, there's nobody there. So it's fascinating. So the Israelis said, oh, the Palestinians, they're never willing to talk, you see. Once again, they're not willing to meet with us. They're not, Then we find out that the guy was lynched. You know, he was in hospital. The whole family was in hospital. That's why he wasn't there. Palestinians thought, why didn't he bring somebody else? So what do you mean, why didn't we bring somebody else? We've had 6 months trying to arrange you a meeting with the head of security. You want us to pull out some plumber from the house next door and talk to him? What are you talking about? So it was fascinating because both people came with their defaults, right? They came with their defaults, right? The Israelis, they're not willing to meet with us. The Palestinians, you don't care about us. You're not willing. It was fascinating. And then we sort of opened that up for a little discussion. Had some tea and somebody came and went home. There was nothing to do, but there was an engagement. There was, in that same meeting, we went to, it was very interesting, we went to Kiryat Anavim, which is the cemetery of the members of the Haganah, the Palmach, that died in 1948 in the battles around the Jerusalem corridor, right? And they were very, very, very serious battles. And many, many people were killed. Of the 6,000 Israelis who were killed in the war in 48, over half of them were killed in those battles. And it's moving in many ways. And it was interesting that there were some Palestinian people there, Palestinian fellows from Nazareth, and in the cemetery, in Kiryat Anavim, like the dead weren't Israelis, they were just dead boys. And they, at that moment, the Israeli Arabs had very different feelings of 48, which is the Nakba. So that was an interesting moment that was shared and talked about. A lot of interesting things happened in that school, and the Palestinian guys then ended up more religious. I heard afterwards. That was sort of interesting. Yeah.
This occurred to me earlier, but it was re-emphasized now because of the lynching. To your knowledge, were any of the participants in the program met with hostility either while they were in or afterwards by their own community because of the tensions, and you shouldn't be hanging around with those folks, what were you doing, and so forth? I just wonder if you're aware of anything like that that was happening. Did they have to be quiet?
We're aware of the problem. We're aware of the problem. One of the reasons that we don't publish the schedule until afterwards is because it could be dangerous for people. And don't put it on the web, and don't send it. Max, the guy who organized, the priest who organized the schools in Uganda, he actually gave an interview to the New York Times. There was a write-up about that school in the Times, and he said the problem is how you engage in such activity without your own community thinking you're a traitor and the other community thinking you're a spy. And, it's a serious problem.
It sounds like the experiences that you yourself have had as a person running this and meeting all these people and seeing these experiences and these groups evolve must have had an incredibly powerful effect on your academic work, on your writing. Concepts like your different way of thinking about sincerity, for example, seem like they were born in this crucible. Could you just say something about how you've been transformed as a thinker and public intellectual because of these experiences?
So I know that I'm a public intellectual, I don't know that I'm a thinker, but the first part of your question I could try to answer. So I have. My thinking has really changed. And I'm much, much more suspicious of theory than I was before. Much, much more suspicious of theory. Much more open to the particular, to the importance of the particular. I did my doctorate in Jerusalem with Shmuel Noach Eisenstadt. I know people might not know who he was, the most important comparative historical sociologist of the 20th century. So he dealt with massive, the axial age and how it worked itself out, over a period of 2,000 years. And some of the books I wrote 15, 20 years ago, I can't read anymore. I don't understand them. Some of the books that I wrote, I don't understand. So that's one thing. That's one thing. A much, much greater respect for the. I'll tell you a story. I'll tell stories. So I met my wife and I were graduate students together. That's how we met. We were TAs in the same Introduction to Sociology and Social Anthropologist. She's a social anthropologist. I'm a sociologist. And so we met and we courted, if we still use that word, walking around the Mount Scopus campus and arguing. I mean, we did other things, but also arguing about sociology and anthropology, sort of the barefooted empiricist versus the theoretician. Well, sort of like after 5 or 6 years in the school, I came to her on my knees and I said, mea culpa, you were right about everything. I was wrong about everything. Theory versus empirical. So that's one way that it changed me. It also, I guess, has put me as a person somewhat, somebody else's dean is here, not my dean, so it's okay. Myself is no longer in the university. Doesn't mean I'm not committed to my teaching and to my work and to my right, but my identity, if you want to use that word, and I don't like to use that word, this isn't the home anymore. This isn't the home. And it has nothing to do with BU, it has to do with academia. Right? It has to do with the type of knowledge we generate and what we do and what we're devoted to. We're too much priests without a church, I think. So the church becomes ourselves, and it's not interesting. I'm not that interested. Other people.
So I think that kind of brings it back to your introduction of your talk, which I really enjoyed, about you were having these feelings about academia and about theory and about how it being 90% cognitive isn't making that connection out to the world. How do you see what you're doing with the school and the way that it has changed you that you just discussed coming full circle? I mean, obviously you want your school's model to be reproduced, but there are people who will come to that from other directions. How can you see it being like a model or a pedagogy to bring what the privilege of academia allows you to think about into the world?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, so you talked about how you were a farmer long before you got into academia. I went the opposite direction. I left academia very early in the game, and I'm now a farmer because I had that feeling, and I had that sort of disconnection from it. But I see how both sides are necessary. You need the kids to be working together, building the houses, and you need them to have those tough conversations. Can you see there being like a model?
Oh, I got it. Now I understand.
Yeah, you get what I'm saying?
So a colleague did something cool that I had a lot of, discomfort with, but he tried something, and so last year, in 2013, right, when we did the school in Bulgaria, Anver Emon, who's a professor of law at the University of Toronto, who was a lecturer in 2 of the schools, got funds and built a program in the University of Toronto Law School for a 2-week program on Islamic law. and he brought graduate students from all over the world in Islamic law, and he used the pedagogy of the school as the basis of his program. So on the one hand, there was something super cool about that, because this was taking this into the university, and he and I had long discussions about it, and I said, I don't have the strength to do this, but you're 20 years younger, go for it. There were huge compromises by doing that, which was they were all graduate students. So I don't care if they come from Egypt or Somalia or Tennessee, they're all graduate students, so they're all in the same role. They might have different colors, they might have different, but they're all in the same role, so that's already not difference, right? But he did the same things. They went to Salafi mosques in Toronto, they went to gay lesbian mosque in Toronto, they used the pedagogy of the school. They did facilitation, they used the tripartite, our evaluator trained their evaluator, they used as much as they can, so that was great. And he thought he was sure to get funding for the next year, and they didn't, because there was no research output. There was no publication at the end. There were incredible articles in Toronto newspapers about how important this is in terms of a bridge between the Muslim communities and the university. I mean, it had everything going for it, but it didn't have 3 published articles at the end. But I think, so I can't do that. I can't do that because I already foresaw that type of result, as I'm too old. But I think something like that can emerge. I think we're going to have to engage in creative thinking to deal with the constraints of the EU in Bulgaria. So we'll see. We'll see. Maybe one of the things I learned, Wes, is to be less rigid than I was 12 years ago. But maybe that's just age, right? That's just age. But now I think we have something. We know what we're doing. We have a pedagogy. We have a set of principles. We have a method. We have a book. And actually, the book has an appendix about how to do this yourself. Actually, it has a sort of appendix about do it yourself. So I'm hoping that people will take it in different directions. And I'm hoping that they also call us up and say, hey, you want to come and talk about, but we'll see. But yeah, I think that there are bits, there are pieces that are like tools, and they're like a screwdriver, so you can use a screwdriver to build a bicycle or build a tank, right? So I think that there are tools here that can be used in different ways, and that I hope that they will be used. And I guess your connection connects to the first one. I mean, I still write theoretical books, right? And I still love it, and it's still a great hit of narcissism. I just don't think it changes anything. But, we all need narcissism. I mean, not different from anybody else. But I'm hoping that Anvar's, he's since had a second baby, so he's not exactly in the state now to try to put together another one, but I hope that he will continue to look for something like this. I talked about the school. I was giving some lectures in Japan this summer. People got very, very excited in universities there, in Yamaguchi Prefectura, and they want to do a school on relations of Japan to Korea and China, which would be fantastic if they did something like that. And I want to do it within the university. That would be very interesting. The people, we have a number, about 3 people in Kyrgyzstan who were fellows in the school. For years we've wanted to do something in Kyrgyzstan. The project manager, who's a former doctoral student of mine here at BU, David Montgomery, did his doctorate on Central Asia and was Peace Corps there. And so we have a connection there. I've been to Kyrgyzstan. And now we're in discussions with the American Embassy to get funds to try to do something. What you have in Central Asia, you have everywhere, which is fascinating. So you have a traditional Islam that managed somehow to exist under communism with a lot of compromises. And of course in Kyrgyzstan with a lot of shamanism as well. And now you have a new generation of kids really coming back from Saudi Arabia and North Africa saying, you guys, you imams don't know what you're doing, and this isn't Islam, this is shirk. And the first thing they do is they change the Qibla, which is really interesting to me. All over the world, the first thing that's done is the Qibla is changed, which to me, the Qibla is the direction of prayer. Right? So to me, so it might be that you have new GPS devices in this, and you can see it's four degrees left or right. but it's rejecting the authority of your fathers, right? For generations and generations and generations and generations, the Qibla was there. Now you're changing it that way. What are you doing? What are you doing? Is this now you're more pious? Or now you're saying, my parents and my grandparents didn't know what they were doing? Anyway, so we're in discussions with the American Embassy about getting funding to do a summer school on this problem, on the relations between the old Islamic elite and the new Islamic elite. The Americans are interested because they're afraid of terrorism and stuff like that. So different people are taking it, right, in slightly different directions, whether it's Islamic studies here, whether it's particular, which is already different from, you know, the original vision, but that's more than fine with me. That's more than fine with me. They should just succeed, that's all.
So we should wrap it up here. I want to thank you very much. It was a wonderful lecture, and thank you everyone for the discussion too. I think it was really very enriching.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much.